Structures of the brain, sagittal plane view. Dura mater, arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space, cerebral spinal fluid, pia mater, cerebrum, cerebellum, midbrain, pons, medulla, central canal, corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, lateral ventricles, fornix, choroid plexus, third ventricle, thalamus, fourth ventricle, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, cerebral aqueduct.
My name is Nelson Bennett, and I'm a professor of biology here at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park. Today we're going to be reviewing a number of major brain structures and briefly mentioning their functions. Here we have a sagittal view of the head with the brain exposed. Let's talk a little bit about the coverings of the brain first. So when we look at the layers of the brain, coverings of the brain here, known as the meninges, we can see a few of the meningeal layers. Clinging directly to the skull itself is the layer known as the dura mater. Right under that would be the arachnoid mater, which is not easily visible in this model, but we do see the space which is under the arachnoid mater, which is this dark gray space known as the subarachnoid space. This is space where cerebral spinal fluid actually circulates in this dark space here. So that would be called the subarachnoid space. And then finally, clinging directly to the surface of the brain is this lighter gray layer known as the pia mater. So the layers that are easily visible in the model would be the dura clinging to the bone, the arachnoid mater not easily visible, but the space under it is called the subarachnoid space, and the pia mater. Talking about the brain itself, we can see the cerebrum here. We can see the cerebellum behind the brain. The cerebellum is largely involved in balance and coordination. You can see the white matter of the cerebellum, which resembles a tree-like structure. This white matter of the cerebellum is also referred to as the arbor vitae, which means tree of life in Latin. And then you see a number of structures that are composed of white matter. Don't forget that white matter is mostly composed of fiber tracts. This large C-shaped structure composed of white matter is called the corpus callosum. It's the major commissure of the brain, which means it's the major connection that connects the one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. The corpus callosum allows both hemispheres of the brain to share information. Under the corpus callosum, in pink here, you can see a very thin membrane which separates two of the ventricles of the brain. Ventricles are fluid-filled spaces in the brain. This thin membrane, which would separate the two lateral ventricles from each other, is called the septum pellucidum. Under that is an arch-shaped structure of white matter here. This arch-shaped structure of white matter is called the fornix. Fornix in Latin means vault or archway. And this fornix basically connects the hippocampus of the brain with the mammillary bodies and eventually the thalamus. These structures are involved in memory and recall. Below the fornix, we can see this purple structure, and if you were able to look at it real close, you could see that this purple structure has lots of blood vessels in it. It's directly below the fornix. This purple structure represents something called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is the structure which actually makes cerebral spinal fluid. If you recall, I mentioned that cerebral spinal fluid circulates out here in the subarachnoid space, but cerebral spinal fluid also circulates in the ventricles within the brain. So let's review the ventricles briefly. We have two lateral ventricles which are not visible in the model because they are on both sides of the brain within the hemispheres, but the septum pellucidum would be the dividing line between the two lateral ventricles. You can see this area here, this shallow depression here, just under the choroid plexus. This depression or space is the third ventricle. The third ventricle is also the location of this structure called the thalamus. So cerebral spinal fluid would circulate in this depression here called the third ventricle. Then cerebral spinal fluid circulates down here through this passageway called the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct is passing through an area of the brain called the midbrain. So this part of the brain is called the midbrain, and the cerebral aqueduct goes right through it. Next, cerebral spinal fluid would circulate in this large space that sits just in front of the cerebellum. This large space is the fourth ventricle. And then finally, cerebral spinal fluid would circulate down the middle of the spinal cord in a passageway called the central canal, which is not really visible in the model, but you'd have to imagine that in the middle of the spinal cord is a very small passageway called the central canal. So to review the ventricle system of the brain, we have two lateral ventricles on each side of the septum pellucidum. We have the third ventricle here in the area of the thalamus. We have the cerebral aqueduct here, which passes through the midbrain. The cerebral aqueduct goes into the fourth ventricle here, which is in front of the cerebellum. And finally, the cerebral spinal fluid would go down the cerebral aqueduct in the spinal cord. Other structures that are important to our brain, as I mentioned, we have the midbrain. We have the thalamus up here in this area of the third ventricle. Just below the thalamus is this triangular area known as the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is very important for controlling a lot of homeostatic functions in the body, such as body temperature, many of your drives, things like that. Hanging from the hypothalamus, we have the small pink structure here, which is your pituitary gland, very important endocrine structure. Hypothalamus is in charge of the pituitary. I already mentioned that this is called the midbrain. In front of the midbrain, or just below it, we have this structure called the pons, and below that we have the medulla. The pons and medulla are both involved in very vital functions such as maintaining respiration and heart rate. So being able to breathe and your heart beating is responsibility of these structures in the brainstem, the pons and the medulla, especially the medulla. So these are highlights of many of the important larger structures that we can see in the sagittal section of the human head and the brain.
Dura mater. Arachnoid mater. Subarachnoid space. Cerebral spinal fluid. Pia mater. Cerebrum. Cerebellum. Midbrain. Corpus callosum. Septum pellucidum. Lateral ventricles. Fornix. Choroid plexus. Third ventricle. Thalamus. Fourth ventricle. Hypothalamus. Pituitary gland. Cerebral aqueduct. Pons. Medulla. Central canal. Cerebrum. Cerebellum. Arbor vitae. Midbrain. Corpus Callosum. Septum Pellucidum. Lateral ventricles. Fornix. Choroid Plexus. Third ventricle. Thalamus. Fourth ventricle. Hypothalamus. Pituitary gland. Cerebral aqueduct. Pons. Medulla. Central canal. Structures of the brain. Sagittal plane view. Dura mater. Arachnoid mater. Subarachnoid space. Cerebral spinal fluid. Pia mater. Cerebrum. Cerebellum. Midbrain. Pons. Medulla. Central canal. Corpus Callosum. Septum Pellucidum. Lateral ventricles. Fornix. Choroid Plexus. Third ventricle. Thalamus. Fourth ventricle. Hypothalamus. Pituitary gland. Cerebral aqueduct.